The day I called my son and my daughter-in-law answered instead, I realized a woman could be pushed out of her own family without anyone ever raising their voice. I had only meant to hear Daniel's voice for a minute or two. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early October, the kind of cool, bright day that made the maple tree outside my kitchen window glow like it had been brushed with fire. I had just poured myself a second cup of coffee and taken a loaf of banana bread out of the oven, the same recipe Daniel used to ask for when he was a boy, when I looked at my phone and thought, I'll call him now. Nothing important. No emergency. Just a mother missing her son in the quiet middle of the day. The call rang twice before Olivia answered. Daniel's too busy for you right now, she said. Not hello. Not let me see if he's free. Not he'll call you back. Just that. Too busy for you. There was something in the way she said it that stayed with me, something polished and flat and carefully placed, like a glass set down on a table without a sound. For a second I thought perhaps I had misheard her. At my age, people are quick to assume confusion. They speak slower than necessary, louder than necessary, kinder than they feel. But I had heard her perfectly. In the silence that followed, I became aware of everything around me at once. The ticking wall clock above the refrigerator, the faint hum of the dishwasher, the sweet smell of brown sugar and vanilla still hanging in the kitchen. I tightened my hand around the phone. I only wanted to say hello, I told her. He's in the middle of something, she replied, and then, after the slightest pause, I'll let him know you called. The line went dead so neatly it almost felt rehearsed. I stood there for a long moment with the phone still pressed to my ear, as though if I waited long enough, I might hear my son in the background saying, Mom, don't hang up. But there was nothing. Only my own reflection in the dark microwave door. A woman of 68 with silver hair pinned up carelessly and reading glasses slipping down her nose, standing in a kitchen made for a family and filled with the quiet of one person. I set the phone on the counter and told myself not to be foolish. Daniel had a demanding job. People were busy. Wives answered phones. Days got crowded. Life moved fast when you were still in the center of it. I knew all the excuses because I had been making them for months. Every missed holiday brunch. Every late reply. Every promise of next weekend. I had folded each one neatly and tucked it away where it would not trouble me too much. But that afternoon, Olivia's words did not stay folded. They opened inside me. Too busy for you. Not too busy. Too busy for you. I looked at the banana bread cooling on the rack, golden at the edges, perfect in the middle, and suddenly I felt embarrassed by it, by the small domestic hope that had led me to believe I might drop by later with a warm loaf and hear my son laugh the way he used to. Outside, a gust of wind shook loose a scatter of red leaves, and they skidded across the patio like little things trying to escape. I do not know why that was the moment my heart changed. Perhaps because cruelty is not always loud. Sometimes it arrives dressed as efficiency. Sometimes it comes in a calm female voice through a phone line. And sometimes the deepest wound is not being told you are unwanted, but being told, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, that your place in someone's life can be managed by another person. The next morning, I woke before sunrise the way I often did now, not because I had anywhere special to be, but because silence had a way of rising early in my house. The bedroom was cool, and the pale light coming through the curtains turned everything soft and colorless for a few minutes, as if the world had not fully decided to begin. I lay still for a while, listening to the old familiar sounds of the house settling around me, the creak in the hallway floorboards, the low click of the heat coming on, the faint rattle of branches against the siding outside. There was a time when mornings had felt full before a single word was spoken. My husband would have been reading the newspaper at the kitchen table. Daniel, as a teenager, would have come downstairs half awake and hungry, opening cabinets as if they had personally offended him by being empty. Back then, a house like mine never stayed quiet for long. Now the quiet stretched from room to room like something permanent. I got up, pulled on my robe and went into the kitchen. I filled the kettle, measured out coffee, sliced 2 pieces of the banana bread from the day before, then wrapped one of them again because I had no appetite for more than half of one. Small habits like that had become their own kind of company. I sat by the window and looked out at the backyard where the grass still glistened with dew. The bird feeder Daniel installed for me 3 springs ago swayed gently in the breeze. I remembered how proud he had looked standing on that ladder, insisting I should not hire anyone for such a simple job. "I have got you, Mom," he had said then, smiling down at me. It is strange how one sentence can live in your heart for years, while another one can bruise it in an instant. I told myself again that Olivia had probably caught him at a bad time. She had always been polished, efficient, the sort of woman who folded every throw blanket sharply and answered questions with the confidence of someone who believed she was improving your life whether you asked her to or not. Maybe she had not meant anything by it. Maybe I was being sensitive. Older women are trained to ask themselves that before they ask whether someone else has been unkind. We soften the edges of other people's behavior until our own pain barely has a shape. Still, I found myself glancing at my phone every few minutes, expecting Daniel's name to light up the screen. By 10 o'clock, nothing. By noon, still nothing. I carried the phone from room to room as I dusted the living room shelves, watered the fern on the front porch, and folded a basket of towels that could easily have waited until tomorrow. At one point I even checked the volume, as if the problem might be mechanical and not human. I did not call again. That was pride perhaps, or maybe self-protection. There is a point in life when you learn that reaching twice after being pushed away once can feel less like love and more like begging. Around 3 in the afternoon, I stood at the hall closet and ran my hand over the sleeve of Daniel's old high school baseball jacket, the one he never took when he moved out. I had kept it all these years because mothers keep odd things. A jacket, a science fair ribbon, a chipped mug from college. Proof that someone belonged to you before the world taught them otherwise. I closed the closet door gently and stood there longer than I needed to. It was not just that I missed my son. It was that I could feel something shifting in the space between us, something subtle and deliberate, like furniture being moved 1 inch at a time until eventually the room no longer looked like home. By Friday, I had convinced myself that what happened on the phone was nothing more than an awkward moment stretched thin by too much solitude. That is the danger of being alone too often. You begin to negotiate against your own instincts. You take a sharp remark and turn it in the light until it almost looks harmless. So when I woke that morning and saw the container of banana bread still sitting untouched on the counter, I decided I would stop thinking and simply drive over to Daniel's house. It was not a dramatic decision, just a practical one. Mothers have shown up at their children's doors for less. I packed the loaf into a canvas tote, added a jar of apple butter I had bought from the farmer's market the week before, and changed into a navy sweater and slacks. The drive took 25 minutes if traffic on Maple Avenue was kind, and that morning it was. The sky was high and pale, the sort of autumn sky that makes every roofline look sharper. As I turned into Daniel's neighborhood, I noticed the maples along the sidewalk had started dropping leaves in copper-colored piles at the curb. The houses all looked polished and self-assured, with trimmed hedges and seasonal wreaths and front porches staged as if someone might photograph them. Daniel had always liked order. Even as a little boy, he lined up his toy cars by size and color. Olivia liked appearances in a different way. With her, everything had to look intentional. By the time I parked in front of their house, I had already rehearsed the conversation in my mind. I would smile, hand over the bread, say I was nearby and thought I would stop in for a minute. Daniel would look surprised but pleased. Olivia might be cool but polite. The whole thing would last 10 minutes, and afterward I would come home embarrassed by how much meaning I had attached to one sentence. That was what I expected. What I found was not rude enough to name outright, which somehow made it worse. Olivia opened the door after my second knock. She was dressed beautifully for noon on a weekday, in cream slacks and a fitted sweater, her hair pinned back without a strand out of place. She looked at the tote bag in my hand before she looked at me. "Evelyn," she said, with that bright little note in her voice that managed to sound both cheerful and inconvenienced. "What a surprise." I smiled and held up the bread slightly. "I was in the area," I said, though we both knew I was not. "I brought this for Daniel. Is he home?" Her expression did not change, but something behind it tightened. "He is on a work call." "Oh," I said. "That is all right. I can wait a minute." She hesitated only a second before stepping aside. "Of course." The house smelled faintly of lemon polish and expensive candles. It was spotless in the way houses often are when no one is actually living freely inside them. A gray throw blanket lay folded with perfect symmetry over the arm of the sofa. 3 design magazines were stacked on the coffee table with their corners aligned. Even the bowl of decorative gourds in the entryway looked curated rather than seasonal. I sat on the edge of the couch while Olivia remained standing for a moment, as if deciding where to place me. Then she took the tote from my lap and disappeared into the kitchen without asking whether I wanted coffee. I could hear cabinets opening, dishes being moved, the careful household sounds of someone making activity where conversation should have been. A few minutes later, Daniel came down the stairs. He smiled when he saw me, but it was the delayed smile of a man arriving late to a scene someone else had already explained to him. "Mom," he said, giving me a quick hug. "You should have called first." The words were simple, ordinary even, but I felt them land with a quiet weight. Not "I am glad you are here." Not "this is a nice surprise." "You should have called first." I looked past him toward the kitchen where Olivia was pouring sparkling water into tall glasses, as if we were strangers conducting a careful visit. "I did call," I said gently. Daniel nodded, but not in a way that invited more. "This week has just been hectic," he said. "A lot going on." He sat across from me rather than beside me, elbows on his knees, already looking half pulled away. I noticed then that every answer he gave seemed to arrive after the briefest glance toward the kitchen, not enough to accuse but enough to unsettle. I asked about work. He answered. I asked about the trip they had mentioned taking next month. Olivia answered from the doorway before he could. I asked whether they would be coming for Thanksgiving this year, and Daniel said, "We have been keeping things flexible." That word can sound warm in a marriage. It can also sound like a locked gate. By the time I stood to leave, the banana bread had been plated, sliced, and set neatly on the counter, untouched by either of them. Olivia walked me to the door with perfect manners. Daniel kissed my cheek and told me they would figure something out soon. As I stepped onto the porch, I heard Olivia say softly behind me, not softly enough, "We really need to be clearer going forward." I did not turn around. I just walked to my car with my head high and my chest hollow, carrying the strange new feeling that I had not visited my son that afternoon so much as reported to a household where my presence required management. All weekend I told myself there was still room for misunderstanding. Age teaches you how often pain arrives wearing ordinary clothes, and how tempting it is to excuse what you do not want to face. I cleaned the kitchen twice on Saturday morning, not because it needed cleaning, but because movement gave shape to the hours. I wiped down the counters, reorganized the spice drawer, polished the silver-framed photograph of Daniel at 8 years old with one front tooth missing and grass stains on his jeans. In that picture, he was grinning at me from the back porch, holding up a cardboard birdhouse we had painted together one humid July afternoon. He had insisted on painting the roof blue because he said birds deserved color too. I stood there with the frame in my hand longer than necessary, wondering when exactly a son begins to disappear from his mother in ways that leave no evidence anyone else would accept. On Sunday evening, I sat at the kitchen table with a bowl of soup growing cold in front of me, and began doing something I had avoided for months. I opened my messages and started scrolling backward. At first, nothing looked unusual. There were the usual exchanges. "Hope you are both well. Let me know if Sunday still works. I made extra pie if you want me to drop some off." Then I began noticing the rhythm of the replies. Not Daniel's old voice, not the warm, slightly careless way he used to text, but something cleaner, shorter, more managed. "We are tied up this weekend. We already have plans. Daniel says thank you. Daniel says he will call later." It struck me then that over the past year I had not actually heard my son say several of the things I had assumed came from him. I had only read them. I set my spoon down and kept going. Easter brunch. Declined. Father's Day cemetery visit for my husband. Too much going on that morning. My birthday lunch. Rain check. A Saturday hardware store trip Daniel had suggested himself months ago, and then somehow forgotten. One by one, the moments I had shrugged off as adulthood began to line up in a pattern so neat it made my chest tighten. Not random. Not occasional. Systematic. I took out a notepad and, without quite meaning to, began writing dates. It felt foolish at first, almost theatrical, like the sort of thing lonely women in movies do when they have too much time and not enough perspective. But I kept writing. Thanksgiving. No confirmation. Christmas Eve. Changed plans late. Emily's piano recital. Was never told the correct time. By the time I reached spring, I had stopped pretending I was overreacting. I was not looking at missed calls and crowded schedules anymore. I was looking at a trail. The next morning I drove to the pharmacy and then to the grocery store, moving through my errands with that strange feeling of being both fully present and elsewhere. At the produce section, I ran into Grace Miller, who had lived 3 houses down from us when Daniel was growing up. Her hair was whiter now and cut short in that practical style women choose when they no longer care to fuss with nonsense. She hugged me warmly and asked after Daniel before I had the chance to ask after her. "I saw him at the home store 2 weeks ago," she said. "He was picking out patio furniture, I think. Such a sweet boy. He said you were doing well and enjoying your quiet time." I smiled automatically, but something inside me went still. "My quiet time?" I repeated. Grace nodded. "He said you had been wanting more space lately. Less family bustle. I thought that sounded unlike you, but you never know. People change." I do not remember what I said after that. Something polite. Something smooth enough to get us both through the moment. But the drive home felt different from every drive before it. My hands were steady on the steering wheel. Yet I could feel the truth settling into place with an almost audible click. I had never once told Daniel I wanted less family. I had never asked for distance. I had been mourning it. Someone had not merely been keeping him busy. Someone had been translating me into a woman I did not recognize, and my son, for reasons I did not yet understand, had accepted the version of me that made his absence easier to live with. That afternoon, I came home with a bag of groceries I did not remember choosing and set it on the kitchen counter without unpacking it right away. The apples rolled gently against one another inside the paper sack, and a carton of eggs pressed against a loaf of wheat bread. But I just stood there looking at the notepad I had left beside the fruit bowl before leaving for the store. The dates were still there in my neat blue handwriting, each one ordinary on its own, together something else entirely. I sat down, pulled the pad closer, and added what Grace had told me. "Daniel believes I want space." I stared at that sentence until it stopped looking like language and became what it really was, proof. Not legal proof. Not the kind anyone could wave in a courtroom or frame as evidence. But the kind a mother recognizes when she has spent decades learning the difference between her son's true voice and the one he uses when someone has already told him what to think. For a long time I had blamed time, marriage, work, the speed of modern life, all the invisible currents people use to explain why families drift apart. But drift is one thing. Drift happens without design. This felt arranged. By early evening, the light outside had turned the backyard amber, and the house took on that hushed feeling it always had just before dinner in the old days. I used to love that hour. My husband would come in through the garage smelling faintly of cold air and sawdust or engine oil or whatever task had held him after work, and Daniel would thunder down the stairs asking what was for dinner before he had even reached the kitchen. The world felt simple then, not because it was, but because love moved more freely through it. I do not know if that is the real cruelty of growing older, the losses themselves, or the way memory keeps placing warm things beside cold ones so you can feel the contrast more sharply. I opened the refrigerator, put away the groceries one by one, and found myself holding a container of potato salad I had bought automatically, because Daniel used to like it with paprika on top. I stood there with the refrigerator door open, cool air touching my face, and understood that I had been living as though he might return to me unchanged if I simply stayed available enough. The realization was not dramatic. It was quiet. Quiet enough to hurt. Around 7 my phone buzzed. For one absurd second I thought it might be Daniel. It was Emily instead, my niece's daughter, 23 years old and kind in that unguarded way young women still are before life teaches them to edit every instinct. She asked whether I was coming to her mother's brunch the following Sunday. I stared at the message, confused, then called her. "What brunch?" I asked. She went quiet. "I thought your invitation got there weeks ago," she said carefully. "Aunt Rachel said Olivia offered to pass things along since she was seeing Daniel that weekend." I sat down so quickly the chair scraped against the tile. "No," I said. "Nothing got passed along to me." Emily hesitated and I could hear voices in the background, a television somewhere, the clink of dishes. Then she lowered her voice. "Aunt Evelyn, I probably should not say this, but this is not the first time I have heard something like that. At Easter, Olivia told my mom you had stopped enjoying big family gatherings. She said smaller visits were easier for you now." I closed my eyes. There it was again. That same careful rewriting of me into someone quieter, more distant, more conveniently absent. Did Daniel say that? I asked. Emily took a breath. I do not know. But Olivia says a lot of things as if they come from both of them. After we hung up, I did not cry. Tears would have almost been a relief, and what I felt was sharper than grief. It was clarity. I went back to the notepad and added 2 more lines. Family brunch invitation intercepted. Easter narrative repeated to others. The list was beginning to look less like hurt feelings and more like architecture, as if someone had been building a version of my life in which I would appear less and less until eventually no one remembered I had once stood at the center of it. I rose, walked to the hallway mirror, and studied my own face. I looked tired, yes. Older, certainly. But not fragile. Not confused. Not someone who needed others to explain her own heart. If Olivia had been speaking for me, and if Daniel had been letting her, then the next step could not be another dropped loaf of banana bread or another call politely ignored. For the first time in months, maybe years, I stopped asking whether I was imagining things and started asking something better. How long had this been happening? And how much of my son's silence had been chosen for him before he ever realized he was losing me too? The next morning, I did something I had not done in a very long time. I stopped waiting for feelings to become clearer and started gathering facts instead. There is a dignity in patience, but there is also a point where patience becomes a room other people keep you in because it makes their lives easier. I made a pot of coffee, opened the curtains, and sat down at the dining room table with my phone, my notepad, and the old laptop I mostly used for recipes and church newsletters. Outside, the sky was pale and clean, the kind of October morning that makes every tree branch look sharpened against the light. Inside, the house was still enough that I could hear the faint tapping of my own fingernails against the ceramic mug. I opened my email first. I searched Daniel's name, then Olivia's, then words like dinner, brunch, family, Sunday, holiday. At first, the screen filled with the usual clutter of years, grocery coupons, appointment reminders, forwarded chain messages from women I had not seen since my husband's memorial service. But slowly patterns surfaced. An email from Rachel sent 3 months earlier with the subject line family lunch this Saturday. It had never been opened because it had never reached my inbox. I found it instead in a shared family thread Emily had once included me in by mistake, a thread where replies continued after I had somehow disappeared from the list. In one message, Olivia wrote, "Evelyn is taking more quiet time these days, so we are trying not to pressure her." The words were polite enough to pass in public. That was her talent. She rarely said anything cruel in a way that could be quoted as cruelty. She arranged reality instead. She made exclusions sound considerate. She made distance sound like a favor. I sat back in my chair and pressed my lips together until they hurt. Then I opened my call history and wrote down more dates. Missed calls that had never been returned. Calls answered by Olivia, not Daniel. Messages sent by me at 10 in the morning, answered from his phone at 11 at night with language too crisp, too formal, too unlike him. Daniel had always texted the way he spoke, warm but rushed, with the occasional misspelled word and an extra exclamation point when he was trying to sound cheerful. These replies felt edited. I was in the middle of comparing 2 messages when the phone rang. For a second my heart stumbled. It was Daniel. I let it ring once more before answering, not to punish him, but to steady myself. "Hi, Mom," he said, and there was something almost cautious in his voice, as though someone had reminded him to call. "Sorry, things have been hectic." I looked out the window at the bird feeder swaying over the damp grass. "I know life gets busy," I said. "How have you been?" "Good. Busy. You know." There was a pause after each sentence, the kind of pause that suggests a person is dividing his attention or measuring his words. I pictured Olivia nearby without even meaning to. "I ran into Grace yesterday," I said lightly. "She mentioned seeing you at the home store." Another pause. "Oh, right. Yeah. We were picking up some patio things. She said you told her I have been wanting more space lately." This time the silence was longer. Not shocked. Not confused. Careful. "I guess I just meant you seem to be enjoying your own routine," he said finally. "Olivia said you had been pulling back a little." There it was. Not certainty. Not memory. Borrowed understanding. I did not correct him yet. I wanted to hear how far the borrowed story had traveled. "Did she?" I asked. "Well," he said, and I could hear him shifting. Maybe moving into another room. Maybe not. You have not seemed interested in a lot of family stuff lately. I lowered my eyes to the notepad in front of me, where dates and brief descriptions filled the page in tidy rows. Birthday lunch canceled. Easter changed. Brunch invitation intercepted. The list looked calm. More calm than I felt. Daniel, I said very gently, who told you that? He exhaled, and for the first time since he called, he sounded tired rather than busy. Mom, I do not want to do this over the phone. I almost smiled then, though not from warmth, because people only say that when the truth has already entered the room, and they are looking for a larger space to avoid it. Neither do I said. Then let us not. We ended the call politely, almost tenderly, and I placed the phone face down on the table. My hands were steady. My breathing was steady. But inside me, something had shifted beyond doubt. This was no longer about my son being too busy, or marriage-changing priorities, or the ordinary drift of adulthood. My voice had been carried to him through someone else for so long that he no longer knew what it sounded like when I spoke for myself, and I knew then that the next conversation would have to happen where all three of us could hear the same words at the same time. For the rest of that day, I moved through my house with the strange calm that comes after confusion has finally chosen a shape. I changed the sheets on the guest bed, watered the fern by the front window, and took a roast out of the freezer to thaw in the refrigerator, not because I was hosting anyone yet, but because action kept my thoughts from turning wild. When something is wrong in a family, people often say they want peace, when what they really want is silence. I had lived inside that kind of silence for too long. By late afternoon, the sky had turned a washed-out silver, and a soft wind kept worrying the leaves across the driveway. I put on my coat and drove to the cemetery where my husband was buried, something I had not planned to do but felt drawn to all the same. The grounds were quiet, trimmed close and neat, the rows of granite markers stretching out under the cold light like sentences finished long ago. I stood in front of his headstone with my gloves in one hand and told him everything out loud, not because I believed the dead could fix the living, but because I needed to hear the truth spoken in my own voice without interruption. I told him about the phone call, the intercepted invitations, the careful little lies shaped to sound like concern. I told him our son had begun answering me in language that did not belong to him. And then I said the one thing that had been sitting in me for days. I do not know whether Daniel is weak or simply tired, but someone has taught him that comfort matters more than truth. The wind moved through the bare branches above me with a dry whisper. I stood there a little longer, feeling neither dramatic nor broken, only certain. On the way home, I stopped for gas and then at the small bakery on Elm Street where they make the apple tarts Daniel used to love. I bought two without thinking. Habit is a powerful thing. Even after disappointment, love keeps setting the table. Back in my kitchen, I placed the white bakery box beside the stove and took out my notepad again. I went through every date one more time, not to wound myself, but to make sure I would not be softened by the moment when it came. Family has a way of blurring facts once feelings enter the room. I had no intention of raising my voice. I only meant to arrive with a memory stronger than their convenience. At 6:30 my phone rang. Olivia this time. I let it ring once, then answered. Evelyn, she said in that polished tone of hers, smooth as a countertop. Daniel mentioned you seemed upset earlier. I looked down at the list in front of me. She had moved quickly. That told me more than the call itself. I am not upset, I said. I am thinking. There was a pause, delicate but real. I am sorry if there has been any misunderstanding, she replied. We have both been trying to respect your need for space. There it was again, that same careful lie wrapped in the language of kindness. I felt almost grateful hearing it directly from her. There is relief in catching someone repeat themselves. Olivia, I said, still calm. I have never once asked for space from my son. Silence. Not long. Just long enough. Well, she said at last, perhaps you feel differently than you have been presenting. I nearly laughed then, not because anything was funny, but because the audacity of that sentence lit something clean and cold inside me. To be rewritten and then told I had authored the revision myself. Tomorrow evening, I said. I am making pot roast. Daniel likes it with carrots and I believe you prefer green beans instead of peas. Come at 6. Both of you. She did not answer immediately. I could picture her standing in that immaculate kitchen, one hand on the counter calculating. "Tomorrow may be difficult," she said. "No," I replied, and kept my voice so gentle it almost sounded warm. "Tomorrow would be best." Another pause. Then, "All right." After we hung up, I stood very still in the center of my kitchen. The refrigerator hummed softly behind me. Outside, headlights from a passing car swept briefly across the front window and were gone. I looked at the roast thawing on the bottom shelf, the bakery box on the counter, the notepad filled with neat blue lines, and understood that nothing about the next evening would be accidental. I was no longer a mother waiting by the phone to be let into her son's life. I was the woman who had raised him, and tomorrow, for the first time in longer than I cared to admit, he was going to hear me without anyone else standing between us to explain what I meant. The next day unfolded with the kind of precision that only comes when a person has made up her mind and no longer needs to spend energy wondering whether she should. I woke before dawn and lay in bed listening to the house breathe around me, the old pipes ticking softly in the walls, the heater pushing warm air through the vents, the faint whisper of wind brushing the branches outside my window. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, I did not reach for my phone to see whether Daniel had called. I did not need hope to get through the morning. I needed clarity, and clarity is quieter. By 8 o'clock, the roast was in the oven, the potatoes peeled and resting in cold water, the carrots cut into thick coins the way Daniel had always liked them when he was a boy. I set the dining room table with my everyday dishes, not the good china. I had no interest in creating ceremony for people who had mistaken my softness for blindness. Still, the room looked warm by late afternoon, the small lamp in the corner casting a honey-colored glow, the autumn centerpiece of dried wheat and pale pumpkins sitting low enough that no one could hide behind it. At 5:58, headlights swept across the front window. I heard a car door close, then another. When the doorbell rang, I dried my hands on a dish towel, folded it neatly over the counter, and went to answer. Daniel stood on the porch with his shoulders slightly tense, his hands in his coat pockets, his expression already braced. Olivia stood beside him in a camel-colored coat with a silk scarf at her throat, elegant as ever, one hand curled around the strap of her handbag. She smiled first. She always did. "Everything smells wonderful," she said as they stepped inside. "Thank you for having us." "You are welcome," I replied. Daniel bent to kiss my cheek, and for one brief second the gesture felt so familiar it almost hurt. We moved to the dining room, exchanged a few harmless remarks about traffic and the weather, and sat down. I served the roast, passed the green beans, refilled water glasses. Olivia complimented the potatoes. Daniel asked whether I had seen the early frost warning for next week. Anyone listening from another room would have heard a perfectly pleasant family dinner. That is the thing about strain. It rarely announces itself in ugly voices at first. More often, it sits politely at the table and waits for someone honest enough to name it. Halfway through the meal, I set down my fork and looked at my son. "Daniel," I said, and my voice was so calm that both of them lifted their eyes immediately. "I asked you here because I need you to hear something from me directly, not through a text, not through an assumption, and not through anyone else." Olivia reached for her glass but did not drink. Daniel straightened slightly. "Okay," he said. I folded my hands in my lap. "I have never asked for space from you. I have never told anyone I wanted less family, fewer visits, or to be left alone. I have never turned down invitations I did not receive. I have never asked to be spoken for." Daniel blinked, then looked briefly toward Olivia before catching himself. That small motion told me everything. "Mom," he began, "I did not think you were being spoken for." "Then what did you think?" I asked gently. "That I changed without telling you? That I stopped caring whether I saw you on holidays? That I wanted to miss family lunches and Easter and birthday dinners?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. Olivia leaned in just slightly, her expression composed. "Evelyn, I think this is becoming more emotional than it needs to be." I turned my eyes to her. "No," I said. "It has been made less honest than it needed to be." The room went still. Outside, I could hear the dry scrape of leaves moving across the porch. Inside, even the clock in the hallway seemed quieter. I rose from the table and walked into the kitchen, not to retreat, but to return with the notepad I had kept beside the fruit bowl all week. I laid it next to Daniel's plate and sat down again. These are the dates, I said. The family events I was not told about, the invitations that were rerouted, the messages that were answered in your voice but did not sound like you, the things others were told about me that I never once said. Daniel looked down at the page. His face changed slowly, not with anger, but with the dawning fatigue of a man realizing he has accepted convenience in place of truth. Olivia did not look at the paper at all. She looked at me. You are making a list of misunderstandings, she said. No, I answered. I am making a record of patterns. Daniel turned one page, then another. Grace said you wanted quiet time, he murmured. Emily said you were not interested in big gatherings. I held his gaze. I said neither. Olivia set down her fork with care. People may have interpreted things differently. Then why? I asked, still calm. Did every interpretation happen to move me farther away from my own son? For the first time that evening, Olivia had no immediate answer. Daniel sat back in his chair and rubbed a hand over his mouth, looking not at his wife and not at me, but somewhere just past both of us, as if the shape of his life had shifted a few inches and he was only now noticing the room no longer fit the way he thought it did. I did not press harder. I did not need to. Truth has its own weight once it is placed on the table, and I could feel it there between the dishes, heavier than the silverware, heavier than the silence, heavier than all the polite little lies that had carried us to that moment. Daniel did not speak for so long that the ticking clock in the hallway began to sound louder than the three of us. He kept his eyes on the notepad in front of him, one hand resting against his mouth, the other still on the edge of the table as if he needed something solid beneath it. Olivia sat very straight, her shoulders squared, her face composed in the careful way people look when they are trying not to appear cornered. I stayed where I was, my hands folded in my lap, my plate untouched now, the warmth of the room settling around us like something dense and inescapable. At last Daniel looked up at me, and when he did, I saw something I had not seen in a long time. Not certainty, not defense, doubt, real doubt, uncomfortable and late but real. Why would this happen? He asked quietly, though I could not tell whether he was asking me or himself. Olivia answered first. It is not happening, she said, her tone still smooth, still controlled. Your mother is taking separate moments and turning them into a story. Daniel did not look at her. He kept looking at me. Mom, he said, did you really not know about Rachel's brunch? No, I said. And I did not know the correct time for Emily's recital either. I did not ask for quiet holidays. I did not ask for space. I asked to be included, in every ordinary way a mother asks without making a spectacle of it. He lowered his gaze again, and I watched the truth move across his face in slow, painful lines. It is one thing to discover that someone has been dishonest. It is another to realize your own comfort helped make room for that dishonesty to grow. Olivia finally turned toward him. Daniel, this is exactly why I tried to simplify things, she said. Your mother gets hurt easily, people feel pressured, plans get complicated. I was trying to reduce tension. I nearly smiled at that. There it was, stripped to its essence. Not love. Not misunderstanding. Management. She had reduced tension the way people reduce clutter, by removing what does not fit the picture they prefer. Daniel looked at her then, fully, and something in his expression shifted. Did you tell people Mom wanted distance? He asked. Olivia crossed one leg over the other, elegant even now. I said she seemed to enjoy more quiet. That was not unreasonable. Did you answer my phone and tell her I was too busy for her? Daniel's voice was still not loud, but it had changed. No longer drifting. No longer borrowed. Olivia's eyes flickered once, the smallest break in her composure. You were busy, she replied. You always are. Daniel drew in a breath and let it out slowly. That was not the question. The room went still again. I looked at my son and thought how strange it was that a man could sound more like himself in one difficult sentence than in 100 easy ones. Olivia set her napkin beside her plate. I did what I thought was best for our life, she said. For our peace. Daniel gave a short, tired shake of his head. No, he said. You did what was easiest for you. He turned back to me then, and the look in his eyes was harder for me to bear than indifference had ever been. Regret, when it is sincere, carries its own kind of ache. I should have called more. I should have asked questions. I should not have let someone else define my relationship with you. I listened without interrupting. An apology can be honest and still arrive too late to undo what made it necessary. You are right, I said. Not sharply. Not cruelly. Simply true. Olivia rose from the table after that, gathering herself with brittle dignity. She said she would wait in the car. No one stopped her. The front door opened and closed a moment later, and the house seemed to exhale. Daniel remained seated across from me, looking suddenly younger and older at the same time. The boy who once built birdhouses in my backyard was gone, of course. In his place sat a grown man learning how much can be lost when love is left unattended. I do not expect this to be fixed tonight, I said after a while. I am not interested in promises made because you feel ashamed. I am interested in what happens next over time, when no one is arranging the truth for you. He nodded, his eyes bright though he did not cry. Neither did I. Some moments are too clear for tears. I stood and began gathering plates, not to dismiss him, but because the dinner was over and life has a way of asking to be continued even after the ground shifts beneath it. Daniel rose immediately and took the serving dish from my hands, setting it gently on the counter. It was such a small gesture, but it carried the awkward sincerity of someone trying, for once, to act without being told how. At the door he hesitated, his hand on the knob, the cold night waiting just beyond the glass. Can I call you tomorrow? He asked. I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt something inside me settle into place. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But the end of begging. You may, I said. And this time, Daniel, I would like to hear your voice. He nodded once and stepped out into the dark. I locked the door after he left, then stood in the quiet kitchen with the dishes, the notepad, and the faint smell of rosemary and roast still in the air. I was alone again, yes, but not in the same way. Before, I had been waiting to be let back into my son's life. Now the door between us stood open, and whether he walked through it with honesty would be his choice. As for me, I was finished shrinking myself into someone easy to set aside. I had not raised a son to forget me, but if he had nearly done so, then he would have to remember me properly now, not as a voice filtered through someone else's convenience, but as the woman who had loved him first, stood still when truth mattered, and finally refused to disappear just because silence had been more comfortable for everyone else. Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new stories.